So you're in Los Angeles, and you eventually went for your doctorate in Oregon, right?
Right.
Now, Oregon was, I think, at the time that you arrived, it was already a hotbed of behavior therapy.
Exactly.
Patterson was Patterson
Was there.
Robert Weiss was there.
Exactly.
Yeah. So did you go there because you were interested in behavior therapy, or did you go to Oregon and then you were immersed in that culture?
I went part of both, a little bit of both. So I knew it was behaviorally oriented, and at UC Santa Barbara, I'd had enough courses to give me a hint of behavioral approaches, and at the time there was a real scientific approach
Sure.
to psychology, and so that appealed to me.
Right.
But I also went there because a friend of mine had gone there earlier and said it was a great program, and so there were some personal reasons like that.
Okay.
And also another reason I got in there.
Right. Well, I mean, did you apply to other places?
I applied to other places.
Was that your first choice that you wanted to go there? Or?
It was a top choice. It wasn't necessarily my first choice, because I didn't get into my first choice because my first choice was Yale, and I wanted to go there. And
which is very psychodynamic,
wasn't it? Which I didn't know at the time.
Yeah. So
I was going there just because it was Yale.
Right. It's not a bad reason. But okay, so you're there and you're doing a lot of behavioral stuff,
Right.
And now you are doing integrative behavioral work. So could you integrate behavioral couple work?
Mm-hmm.
Could you draw the distinction, like how would you define behavioral couple therapy? What's the essence of that?
Mm-hmm.
And then what are you integrating into that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So behavioral couple therapy is, should I talk more to them or to you, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think to them a little
okay.
bit more.
So behavioral couple.
You could just look at me every once in a while in case I want to ask a question.
I'll try not to ignore you, Rich.
Okay. I'll raise my
Raise your hand, please.
Okay.
Don't interrupt me.
All right.
So behavioral couple therapy, it's very straightforward. It's the idea that couples are having problems, and so you want to help them change and accommodate to what the other likes and what the other dislikes. So if somebody thinks that the other, is too critical, then you try to get it so they become less critical. Or if one thinks the other's not affectionate enough, you try to get them to be more
So
affectionate.
you're changing frequencies of behavior.
Changing frequency of the behavior. And the simple idea in behavior therapy is that people are satisfied as long as the positives sort of substantially outweigh the negatives. And there's certainly some truth in that.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to enjoy a relationship if it's primarily negative things that are going on between the two of you. But it is a kind of, overly simplified view, because a couple of key things that come up for a behavior therapist is that it's like what Mark Twain said about smoking. He said, it's easy to quit smoking. I've done it 100 times.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get people to change in their relationships. They change, but then they kind of go back to their old patterns.
Right.
So they can improve for a little bit and go back. So that's one problem. Another problem is that, the kind of changes people want in relationships, sometimes there's, you mentioned emotion being important. Sometimes a key component of that is emotion. So, you may not want your partner to be so critical of you, but then spouses and boyfriends and girlfriends, are very sensitive to each other. So even if your partner doesn't voice the criticism out loud, you can sense that they're unhappy with you. Mm-hmm. And so just that they stop saying it may not completely solve the problem. Or on a more positive side, sometimes people want their partner to be more interested in them or more responsive to them.
But couldn't you turn those things into overt behavioral responses? I mean, this would be the argument that,
right.
Someone is silently dissatisfied. You
right.
try to increase their explicit statement so then it could be worked on or something.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And certainly there's some room for that.
Yeah.
But it's hard to directly change some of the things that partners want changed. So if one partner wants the other to be more interested in them, more curious about
Yeah,
them,
yeah.
care about them more, they can't just agree, okay, 3 times a week I will really be interested in you,
But I'm sure people did do that.
And they tried to do that.
So my question is, in other words, you're describing some dissatisfaction and some limitations with a mode of therapy that many people practice and
Right.
were committed to that,
Right.
to some degree yourself at the beginning. So was it that you, through your work or through your research, that you identified these kinds of limitations, and that the integration of acceptance was intimately tied to your work and your research experience? Did
Yes.
it grow organically that way?
Yes, it definitely grew out of both the clinical work. So I've always done clinical work, and the difficulties that I ran into with trying to help couples bring about change often, revealed some of the limitations. But for example, somebody makes a change, but the partner says, well, he's just doing that because you assigned it to him.
Right.
So it's not genuine. Or she's doing it, but she doesn't really mean it.
Yeah.
So there's always the issue of authenticity, and then there's the issue, which we found in the research, is maintenance, that people might change and improve, but then they relapse,
Right.
which is a problem all across interventions.
Right, right.
But so Neil Jacobson and I developed IBCT to deal with the problem of maintenance by promoting not just change but also acceptance, and also by trying different, you mentioned rule-governed change, by
Right.
trying something other than rule-governed
Rule-governed
change.
change, yeah. So here's the reason I asked you about whether or not you went from traditional behavioral couple therapy to IBCT, and whether it came out organically
Right,
from
right.
your clinical work, is that when we did our tour of the different major modalities of therapy right now, Dr. Merrickling talked about DBT, which has an acceptance component to it, and then Jackie talked about ACT.
Which obviously has
which-
acceptance.
Yeah, first word, is acceptance. So I'm saying that was there something in the zeitgeist, something going on deeper than the specificities of the work that were fueling some of this too, that ties all these things together?
I think partly just, my guess is, the limitations of the approaches you mentioned, DBT, ACT, IBCT, they came out of behavioral and cognitive behavioral.
Exactly.
And I think it was a recognition of some of the limitations across all of those domains.
Yeah.
And, so that just talking to yourself cognitively, wasn't sufficient to bring about,
Right.
the kind of changes people wanted, or the kind of improvements
So
people
it still was something that in all these approaches that you felt was a kind of progression from the original phases of
Right.
behavior therapy, seeing some of the promise and some of the limitations of it and going to another stage of it. But I find myself thinking that maybe there was also something in the wind that was going on, because it all kind of happened at the same time. And I guess you're saying that because it started from a common point,
Right.
in a way they were all at a similar level. They went in slightly different directions, but they're all responding to the original phase of behavior therapy. But can you entertain the idea that maybe there was something going on in the culture too, that it reflected the maturation of the practitioners, and that all of them came out of a kind of 60s, idealism, and an idealism that was permeating the country. And this notion of behaviorism, that all you had to do is change the environment, and you can, as John Watson said, you can be anything, and that everybody hit a wall, the whole generation hit a wall, and then there was some maturity that there are things that you can change, but things that you have to accept, and that's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. I certainly, that's quite possible, probably.
It's a little
true.
of a sociological,
Right.
generational.
But also added to that, I think, is the influence of Western approaches. Because behavior therapy is Eastern approaches, what I
Yeah.
meant. Behavior therapy is very Western. It's very, you can
Force.
change, individual, do it,
Yeah.
be better, improve yourself.
Right.
And, the Eastern philosophies and religions are much more about acceptance. And I certainly was personally influenced by that when I studied philosophy and religion for my first 2 years.
Right.
Now, Rich, I think it might be helpful because there is something similar in, DBT and ACT, since they've all been exposed to that, and acceptance and IBCT, because we're talking about acceptance, not so much of your internal state as you are of somebody else.
Right.
And just
That's a good distinction. Yeah.
yeah. And so let me I think it would be helpful for you guys to hear how we conceptualize that.
Okay.
And so if you think of any problem in relationship, you can think of it as coming about because there's a provocative behavior by one and a reaction by the other. And both are necessary. And so both the provocative behavior and a sensitive responder. And couples can often get into an argument about that. You made a horrible thing. You did a very provocative behavior. Anybody would hate
You're
what
accounting
you
for the variance, 100% of the variance
100% of the variance.
in my mood.
Right. Or you could say, well, Andy, you're just so sensitive.
Right,
It's
right.
all in you. I did some innocuous thing, and you're reacting like a crazy person to it. Now, but any problem has both components. And what's interesting, I'm going to give you for a couple of examples of how you can have somebody who's not very sensitive and somebody who's very sensitive. So there's a wonderful story of Abraham Lincoln in Sandberg's biography of him. And one day, apparently, Mary Lincoln was quite a volatile person. And he was talking with one of the congressmen, and Mary rushed out of the house and started yelling at Lincoln and then slammed the door and went back in. Now, the senator who was talking to him looked up at him, to see, what his reaction was, because this is a pretty unacceptable thing to do, certainly in that period. And Lincoln smiled at him and said, if you realized how happy that made her feel, you too would have been happy she did that. And of course that surprised him, but it showed that even with a very provocative behavior, he wasn't particularly sensitive to it. And now at the other extreme, this came from a couple that I worked with a number of years ago, where the husband came in and started off the session by talking about how upset he was that he sneezed and his wife didn't say bless you or gesundheit. Okay? Now that's pretty low-level provocative behavior.
Right.
Now, in fact, there was a story behind it because he had earlier in the day, they worked in cubicles near each other, and he heard her sneeze, and so he did this cute thing of calling her on her phone. She answers it, and he says, bless you, or gesundheit, whatever he said. And so that was very cute. They both laughed about that. And then in the evening, they were home together in the living room, and he sneezed, and she didn't even look up. And he realized it wasn't, he was upset by the sneeze, but he realized it was symbolic of what he felt was her lack of responsiveness to him. That he could, all kind of things could happen to him and she would hardly notice.
Right.
And so that became the issue. But those two examples just show you that no matter what the situation, there's always the provocative behavior and the response. And so when we work on acceptance, we're working on
Both of those.
we're working on the response part of it. But when you work on change, you're working on the provocative behavior part of it.
Right.
And so ideally, you work on both of it.
Both
We
of
tried
those.
to balance it in IBCT.
Okay. Maybe let's get into the mechanics of it a little
Sure.
bit more, because I know that you do you separate out an assessment phase of the treatment from the treatment phase.
Right.
And very, very clearly demarcated. Do you know if most couple therapists, or family therapists do that, or is that something that you evolved?
Most of the evidence-based couple therapies do that.
Okay.
And there's more of a push to do that because the issue of violence in couples, that couples who come to therapy, there's often a level of violence, and it's really unethical not to assess for that.
Yeah.
And so that it means that
That's a good example of a benefit of it. I found myself adopting that after we talked about that, not just from that standpoint, but sometimes you'll get a couple and one member of the couple has some individual issues that need to be attended to, either before or concurrently
Right.
with the couple work.
Right.
And I found that if you have a formal assessment period and a feedback session, it's a good stopping point to format the work that doesn't feel kind of judgmental, as opposed to if you begin the work and then you say, well, you have individual issues that we need to address beforehand. It's much clumsier.
Right.
So I think it's good to format that way. But maybe you could speak a little bit to how you conduct the assessment and what you're looking for in the assessment with the deep analysis.
Okay. So the assessment consists of an initial session with both partners, and then a session with partner A and a session with partner B. And then the fourth session is the feedback session.
And what do you do in the first conjoint session and then in the individual session? What's your goals? of doing
Okay,
that?
so in the first session, we want to find out the presenting problem, what they're here for. So we try to get the presenting problem, and then we get a little history of the relationship. So we get the context there. And then in the individual session, we always follow up individually on violence and commitment, whether they really want to improve the relationship or not, whether there are affairs going on, things like that. And then we try to get more information about the presenting problem and a little bit of individual history. Now, all of that is to produce what we call a deep analysis. Now, deep analysis is an acronym, and it's meant to do a deep analysis versus a shallow analysis, but it's an acronym to describe how we conceptualize problems in relationships. And so we identify one or two core issues that the couple has. And then the particular components are, the D refers to differences. So sometimes couples have problems because one, is just naturally this way and the other is naturally that way. And it can be things as simple as one has a high libido, one has a low libido. One is an outdoor person, one is an indoor person. One is a gregarious extrovert, the other is more of an introvert, and so they have conflicts about how often to do social events. So just natural differences between them. Now, sometimes couples can handle natural differences if they don't also have a lot of emotional sensitivities. So emotional sensitivities refers to the fact that we're more reactive to certain things than others. None of us is like a Buddha who's not affected by anything. So maybe somebody has a thin skin and is sensitive to criticism, and so it's very hard for them to.
And do you just is your purpose just to describe that sensitivity? Do you see any benefit in linking that sensitivity? Could be just to genetic kinds of things, physiological things, but sometimes those sensitivities are related to experiences that they've had developmentally, like in their
Absolutely.
attachment history or.
And that's why we get that history, to
Yeah.
try to get some of that. For instance, linking family history to, I did a feedback session not long ago, and one partner, was concerned about being seen and heard by the other, and there was some reality to it. The partner is often, sort of preoccupied, but there was a history that made that person sensitive to it, in that their childhood history, they were kind of ignored by their parents, and their parents were very busy with their careers and everything, and they were
Right.
kind of left alone.
Right.
And so they didn't feel, and so that was an understandable sensitivity that they had.
Right.
And so we try to label the sensitivity and give some context why it makes perfect sense that they have those sensitivities, and not make them feel pathological for having,
Right.
because we all have sensitivities. So somebody may be very thin-skinned because their parent were always on their case, and so now, they don't want anybody,
Criticizing
questioning them
them, yeah,
or criticizing
yeah.
them.
Mhm.
So we try to elucidate the sensitivities that are related to this core issue and are related to the differences about the core issue. So just as a simple example, maybe the couple has an issue about money, one is more of a saver, one is more of a spender, but the saver has a lot of sensitivities because they, went through a lot of financial distress growing
Right,
up, and
right.
so saving for the future is very much driven by anxiety.
Right,
It's not
right.
just a preference, it's,
Okay, so you've established that there are these core differences.
Right.
And then there are emotional sensitivities as well. So that's a DE. And then what's the second E?
the second E is external stressors.
Okay.
And so none of us, are our best selves when we're under a heavy deal of stress. And so often the stressors exacerbate the sensitivities. So if this couple, I'm talking about the spender and the saver, if they've lost some money in the stock market, or one gets a cutback in their pay, then they're going to get stressed, and the saver's going to be even more anxious about saving and watching the money and so
Or
forth.
they may battle on a purchase or
Or
something.
battle on a purchase,
That'd be
exactly.
a common one, yeah. Mhm.
And that leads us to the P, the patterns of interaction. Because the P is couples try to talk about or interact about their problems created by the differences, the sensitivities, the external stressors. And often their discussions about it, at least the couples who come to therapy, their discussions don't resolve the problem or make it better. They're at odds with one another. They often make it worse. And just to finish off the example, if the saver starts, investigating the spender and questioning and challenging them, then the spender often reacts by withholding, not sharing as much, doing things more on the side, which raises the anxiety of the saver, which causes more investigation.
Just
which
amplifies
It
and-
amplifies
yeah,
and
yeah.
escalates. And so that's the deep analysis.
Okay.
So in the feedback session, we try to target the one or two core issues, do a deep analysis of it, but doing that in a way that's a conversation with them, because we may not have it all right.
Right. As a preliminary understanding of the couple,
Exactly.
you share with them the deep analysis.
Exactly.
Okay. And what kinds of reaction are you hoping for from the couple?
Certainly a reaction of recognition. That sounds right.
That makes sense to
That
them.
makes sense. And we try to make it as personal as possible by including examples they've given us.
Mhm.
Or I know, George, that, you probably feel this way because you told me how your mother did so and so and so and so.
Right.
And that really connects them with that.
Okay.
And so we want a sense of recognition, but also we're aiming for a unified view of the problem, that they have a shared story about the problem,
Yeah.
as opposed to, the classic, it's your fault, no, it's your fault.
Right.
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 And here's a shared view that it's not trying to say it's, 65% him and 45% her or whatever. It's a shared problem and a shared understanding.
Right, so it's a collaborative.
A
kind of thing.
collaborative. It's
Yeah.
setting them forward for a collaborative work.
So I want to go on to once you do the deep analysis and the assessment and you go into the treatment phase, but just before we leave the assessment part, I just wanted to clarify one thing. When you were talking about the individual sessions as part of the assessment, and you mentioned in one that, let's say there was an affair going on or something, it brings up the question of who holds privilege in the individual sessions. Is the privilege held by the couple, and you're just doing the individual sessions because it's more efficient to get the information, and it would be almost like the other person was there in terms of confidentiality, or are those sessions, does the individual hold privilege?
It's the individual, and we in the consent form, we give all the rules about confidentiality, but also confidentiality even from the partner. However, we're always going to operate for the best interests of the relationship. Now, to get very concrete about that, if someone in the individual session tells me of an affair, if it was a past affair and it's already over,
Right.
then it's up to them. I'll talk with them about whether they think they should reveal it or not, but it's over. I'm not going to demand that they reveal it. I will preserve that secret for them. But if it's an ongoing affair, then because I'm acting in the interest of the relationship, I say, you need to stop the affair or share this with your partner or both, because I can't work.
And what happens if they say no?
If they say no, first of all, that's very rare. But if they say no, then I say, I really can't do couple therapy with you then. And you'll have to handle that however you want to handle that. If your partner calls me, I will simply say, you have decided to stop couple therapy, and the partner can ask you about why.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to still preserve their secret, but I'm not going to do couple therapy.
Well, you're preserving the secret, but it's suggestive of something really problematic, right?
Well, I'm putting it, the responsibility
On them.
On them.
Yeah.
Your partner has decided not to pursue couple therapy.
Yeah.
And they can say, however they decide to do it, they can tell their partner they
'Cause
hated me.
I do it differently.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about it. I mean, it's a tough
tough
call.
call.
I just say that the privilege is held by the couple.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have any individual interaction with either party in an individual session, or if someone calls up, only tell me anything as if your partner is on the call or there. Now, I realize that I may be not knowing some things,
Right.
but to be in that situation is extremely uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So I've decided that I would rather be lied to than have to deal with that, because I don't want to get into that. But I think that's a debate.
Yeah, it's a debate in the field.
In the field, that
Right,
people
right.
have different views on that.
Different views of it.
Okay, so getting out of the assessment, so then you move on to the active, the treatment
Right.
phase, and I'm interested in you mentioned that acceptance is more than just a philosophical attitude in IBCT, that it's more that you have techniques to facilitate that, right? Could you speak to that? Like, what is the toolkit of promoting acceptance?
There are two strategies that we use to promote acceptance. One strategy is what we call empathic joining. And there the idea is that you're more likely to accept someone the more you understand them. Doesn't mean that you'll find it always pleasant, but let's take an example. Let's say I have a partner who gets upset really easily, okay, or is snappy and critical. And at one level I could just see that's mean, and she's mean to me, and she's, not a nice person at times, and why does she do that, and doesn't she have no more respect for me, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But if I went to the therapist, an IBCT therapist, and they were able to facilitate a conversation where she talked about, or if it was me that did that, let's say it's me that was very snappy at times, and I was able to not feel defensive about that, not feel like I had to defend myself for being snappy. And I could talk about that sometimes I get overwhelmed in situations, and I just try to keep everybody at bay, and that's the way I deal with things when I get overwhelmed. I'm not even aware of it at the time. Sometimes afterward I feel guilty about it. If I really talked about all of that, my partner who's listening to me would have a different impression of it. And the impression would be that my snappiness is not all about her. In fact, it's maybe not primarily about her.
Right.
She's an unfortunate recipient of it sometimes.
Yeah.
And maybe I feel guilty about that or whatever, but it just gives her a perspective. Again, she's not going to like when I'm snappy, but it may give her a better a way of being more accepting of it.
Right.
So that's what we mean by empathic.
Yeah, and I would think that the exploration of possible developmental contributions to the sensitivities could also, growing up, these,
Right.
you were criticized a
Right.
lot, or something like that,
Right.
and they would see that this is, part of their development and their
Right.
history.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, like bringing to fore, I'm thinking of someone, of a woman who was raised in a very authoritarian family. And, the parents weren't particularly warm, but they just were tough and demanding. And now she, not surprisingly, has a tendency to be a little bit authoritarian toward her husband and the children. But it's easier for him to understand that when that context is brought in, when she talks about that. When she talks about, she's not even aware of it. That's just her natural default position, is to, okay, you do this. She just takes charge and tells people what to do.
Right.
And there's some even benefit in that. She gets
Yeah.
things done.
I have a good one for you on this, that I was working with a couple where the husband was raised in a family, there was a lot of secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted his wife to be extremely transparent about anything.
Right.
Okay? If she made a mistake, or anything that went on that was a problem, he just wanted immediate transparency.
Right.
Whereas in her family, when you were found out as a child, you could get severely reprimanded,
Right.
and there was no kind of, well, you did the wrong thing, or it was a major event.
Right.
So so she was like trying to work around it, and then he would catch her, and it would be a terrible experience for both of them.
Well, and Rich, that's an example of sometimes people's sensitivities are just uniquely unmatched.
Yeah.
It's like
Interlocking.
Interlocking.
They just interlock.
There's a novelist, can't remember his name right now. He said, "Let our scars fall in love." It's like two people's sensitivities.
Right.
And so occasionally you'll find, as another example, someone who's very opinionated, and then someone who is very soft-spoken and easily hurt.
Yeah.
And they get together, you know.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that pairing is they have a lot they could learn from each other and benefit from each other. But boy, they have the ability to really upset each other too, and hurt each other.
Yeah. So empathic joining is a major
major
focus of promoting acceptance, and you mentioned there was a second.
The
big
second one is what we call unified detachment, which is more an intellectual analysis of something, and it's often focused on the interaction cycle between them. And let me explain a little bit how this works. When couples come in and talk about a problem, they often mention a particular provocative behavior on the part of the partner. You know, it's like they bring in a snapshot of their partner at the partner's worst, and it's without context.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about, well, how did this get started? What happened? And what lead to what? Then you find out that there are little turning points in an interaction. Things start out fine. You know, he comes home and greets her, and she greets him, and then he asks what's for supper, and, you know, and then all of a sudden it goes haywire. But if you look at it step by step, do what we call a chain analysis or behavioral analysis of it, you see how each partner inadvertently contributed to things escalating out of control. And when couples see that, it makes it harder for them to just take the position, it's all my partner's fault. And, and we try to externalize the problem. It's not so much him or you, it's this dance you get into.
Right.
It's this cycle you get into. And
So the enemy becomes the dance rather than each person in the
each
dance.
person, you know,
Yeah.
you're a bad person because of what you did, or I'm a bad person because of what
And
I
I
did.
think if they see it as the dance, as an interactive problem rather than an indictment of the other person,
Exactly.
then it becomes something that is a collaboration again,
Right,
using
right.
that word. And I think it tamps down some of the negative affect.
Right.
Like they're collaborating on it, they're working on it together.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so then they can sometimes intervene by saying, oh boy, we're getting into it again, or we're doing our
Right.
thing.
We're doing our thing again.
Right,
Do you
right.
label it? Do you use metaphors at all?
Yeah, we will try to label it or try to get them to label it, you know? Like, and if they can come up with a label that is unique to them or has their own, you know, characteristic on it, you know, their cat and mouse game or their, we had one couple who labeled it red alert because that's an old term from communist
Yeah.
days.
That reminds me of some of the stuff from ACT, you know, the idea that instead of self as context, that you're labeling your own stuff,
Right.
you're doing the same thing that the couple is context, that you're taking an observing position on yourself and
Right.
saying, oh, we're doing this again.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, that's the metaphor we use. The idea of unified detachment is to put down your weapons, go up on a little hill, get out your binoculars, and look at the battle going on.
Right.
And describe it. And we're trying to
Right.
help them describe the battle that goes on between them.
Yeah.
And then the impact is, you know, they're less, you know, often less upset at the partner, less upset at themselves, and see it as something, you know, unfortunate, but not so judgmental about it.
Yeah. And have you talked about that with any of your colleagues who do ACT? Because there's where some of the acceptance paradigms seem to have a commonality to it. You know, this idea of going outside of yourself or outside of the couple and observing, you know, and getting some distance from it. I think it's common to what you're describing a little bit.
Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah.
And actually, Steve Hayes, who developed ACT, I mean, he considered, you know, IBCT and DBT as sort of part of this broad
Right.
third wave behavior therapy.
Yeah.
So we talked about
There is a
that.
mindfulness element to observe it in
absolutely.
that kind of way.
Well, and we think of unified detachment as dyadic mindfulness.
Exactly.
Right.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I didn't realize that term, but
Yeah, we use that term, dyadic mindfulness. It's
That's great.
trying to get the couple together to look at it and see it together.
Right. So we just have, you know, a little bit of time, and I want to leave some time for people to ask questions
Sure.
and things. So I just want to bring it to the stuff that you've been doing more recently in terms of your affiliation with the VA. If you could talk a little bit about that, and then also maybe comment on our relationships and the website.
Sure. So first of all, the VA in 2010, well, just a little background. The VA, the Veterans Administration, used to only treat the vet. And families of the vets got very upset by that and lobbied Congress, and in 2008, Congress passed a bill that the VA had to treat the family as well as the vet. So it was a big move. Then in 2010, the VA adopted IBCT as one of their evidence-based treatments. So since 2010, I've been working with the VA to train VA therapists in IBCT and couple therapy. And the idea is that there would be one or more IBCT persons at each major center. So that's been an ongoing work in doing that with the VA. But something more relevant to the group here is the ourrelationship.com. So www.ourrelationship.com. So it's an acronym. We're into acronyms. It's supposed to be to go from my relationship and your relationship to our relationship. But the our are for the 3 phases of the program. The O is for the observation phase. So that's where people go through and they fill out some questionnaires and get feedback about their relationship. It's like the assessment phase.
Yeah, sure.
And they pick a problem. Then the U phase is the understand phase, and they do a deep analysis of the 1 or 2 problems they picked.
Mm-hmm.
And the R phase, the respond phase, is they come up with ways that they could handle it differently, first focusing on what I could do differently, and then focusing on things I'd like you to do differently. And now in each of those phases, they work independently, and at the end of the phase, they come together, and the program kind of leads them through how they talk to one another about what they've done. So they kind of share what they've done individually.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes about 6 to 8 hours. We've literally hundreds of couples have done it. We know that couples show some significant improvement in their relationship as a result of this. And we've followed them up for at least a year, and it's maintained for a year. And because of this work, I say we, but it's a colleague of mine who's really led it, Brian Doss.
Brian Doss, yeah.
And he got a major grant from the government to adapt it for low-income couples. And we did that, and right now it's being offered for free to low-income couples throughout the country. And we've had, I don't know, it's 300 or 400 couples go through it. And again, we're getting pretty good results. To give you just some statistics, with the non-low income couples, we had about 86% completion. So 86% of the couples would go through all 6 to 8 hours of it and complete it, which is quite a bit of time commitments. This is not all at one sitting, of course.
Yeah.
With the low income couples, we're getting a little bit lower, but we're getting over 70% completion. And those who complete it are showing improvements, at least in the short term. We haven't followed them up yet.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, all of you are invited to look at that if you're interested. Low-income couples get to do it for free. Anybody can do it. There's an individual version if your partner won't do it, but ideally you do it with your partner. And it's $50 for the
Now, this is
non-low-income couple.
100% tech. In other words, there's no. Didn't you say to me once that they
Yes.
had somebody that they can consult with, or
coaching.
a coach's associated with it?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up,
Yeah.
Coach. Because actually, in the way we're doing it now, you get 4 coach calls of 15 minutes each. It's a coach, it's not a therapist. They help you with any technological problems, and they help you with some of the, if you're having trouble defining your core issue, things like that.
Yeah.
And they encourage you, if
So-
you're getting stuck.
When you're reporting the 86% completion rate and the 70% with the lower income population, is that with coaching?
That's with coaching.
Without the coaches, did you see a significant increment?
Yeah,
in
without the
completion?
coaching, it drops.
It drops.
Yeah, we know that it drops.
Right.
Now, in fact, we're trying to fool around with automated kind of coaching.
I was just going to
content.
say, like a bot, get a bot
Yeah.
out there.
We're fooling around with that. We're also trying to see if there's certain kinds of couples can do it without the coach.
Yeah.
Because obviously it's much more cost effective if you don't have to have a coach.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm glad you brought up the coach, because there is some.
So your goal is to
human
retire and then to make therapists obsolete.
Before I become obsolete.
That's right, that's right. The last interviewee of the series is this woman, Brenda Wiederholt.
Mhm.
You might have an interesting conversation with her, because she's really on the forefront of the use of technology, apps and websites
Right.
and augmented reality and
Absolutely.
virtual reality. So she might be really interested in that app. And have you ever published anything on that within the cyber psychology areas? You mainly
No.
do it in the relationship area.
No, we've done it in the relationship.
Because I think in the tech cyber psychology, they'd be very interested
Yep.
in that too.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for this.
You're welcome.
We can spend some time fielding some questions for Andy. Don't be shy. Yeah, go ahead, Erin.
So thank you for coming to talk, firstly.
Sure.
When you are, when you have those first meetings with the couples independently, or any of them when they are together, and you see that there's behavior that you find unacceptable, like maybe physical abuse, or somebody is really like getting into their personal, like they demand their like passwords, or they demand to look through their phone, or something that you think
Very intrusive is what you're saying.
exactly they're
Yeah.
intrusive, and you're like, and you're thinking that's not going to help anybody. What do you do about that?
Okay. Well,
Do you want to summarize the question?
Sure. So the question is, what if you find that one of the partners during your assessment phase is doing something that is bad, something like physical abuse or being excessively intrusive, okay? I would make a distinction between the two examples. So physical abuse we are certainly concerned about, because that has the possibility of physical injury and of psychological injury. And so that's what we always assess for violence. And I mean, I won't go into exactly how we do it, but we always assess carefully for violence. And our criteria is if there's been injury or intimidation. By intimidation, mean the person is afraid to speak their mind for fear of physical reprisal. Those are the two red flags that couple therapy may not be able to be done safely. And so we wouldn't want to do couple therapy. Now, with other examples of quote unquote bad behavior, therapists try not to be judges. And so in that case, what I would want the partner who is the recipient of that intrusive behavior, I would want them to help them speak up about its impact on them. And so I would want the partner who is doing the intrusive behavior, if they change that, to do it not because the therapist said you shouldn't do that, but because it bothered their partner. Now, given that sometimes certain kind of intrusive behavior that would bother me doesn't bother the client. And so that's why I'm always interested in the client's reaction to it, and I don't want to jump in and decide what's good and bad behavior, because couples, this is obvious, but couples are very different, and what seems crazy for some couples is okay for other couples, in the same way that most couples may endorse monogamy, but some couples don't endorse monogamy. And so what is good for one is not necessarily good for the other.
Yeah. Maybe we should make this explicit, because you were making a distinction between intimidation and emotional abuse or physical abuse. So I'm sure this comes up, that there are limits of what is acceptable, right? You're promoting acceptance, but it doesn't have an
Oh yeah,
it's not a
no,
limit.
we're not promoting acceptance of behavior that is harmful.
Harmful to people.
We certainly don't want to do that.
Right. And I've heard other people, I've heard you make a distinction between acceptance and resignation.
Mm-hmm.
That issue comes up. You want
Right.
to speak to that a little
Yeah,
bit?
yeah. In other words, we're aiming for acceptance based upon an understanding of the partner, and that your partner is doing some things that sometimes bother you, but it's just part of the package. Versus resigned to something, he's just going to criticize me and abuse
So
me, and I just have to live with it.
Yeah, it's acceptance in the service of growth and
Of
positive
growth,
movement,
right.
not giving up. Yeah.
Right.
Mike, did you have a question?
Yeah, so you've talked about a lot of, about acceptance and as one of the integrative goals.
Pieces, right.
And then, but I'm curious, what does the change look like exactly? Because I know it's like, because acceptance, you're saying accepting the other person for what he or she does, or because I'm sort of getting the idea, it's like, so is this sort of philosophy like the idea that like people don't really change? And what does this change look like? Is it the change of the relationship, change of the outlook on the relationship, or is it the change of like person?
Well, it's typically when couples talk about their issues, they're very concrete things that bother them. They're bothered because one person is very critical, or they're bothered because one person is never around and or very inattentive, or they're bothered because their partner is not very sexually responsive. So they have very concrete things that they're concerned about. So we're not usually talking about changing the person in some broad way. We're talking about things that people do that bother them, and that have, as I mentioned, this component of it's a provocative behavior and it's a sensitive response to it. But as a result of these discussions, when you have a constructive discussion about it, and when you start from the idea that these two people do care about each other, and they don't willingly or intentionally try to hurt the other person, except maybe when they're so hurt that they do something out of revenge, then partners will sometimes make changes automatically or accommodations. And so what we're seeking for is some combination of acceptance and change. So just take the common thing of criticism, that the change might be the person is not quite as critical, or maybe they're just as critical, but the intensity is not so great. Or maybe they're just as critical at a frequency basis, but they step back from it. They make a move after being really critical of their partner to kind of make amends with their partner. There are a lot of ways that people can change that can be helpful for the relationship, and we don't know ahead of time what the way they're going to change. But to just take that criticism example, that what we would hope would happen would be there is some change in the criticism, whether it's the intensity or the frequency or their ability to step back and recover if they've said something critical that hurt the partner, as well as the partner's ability to accept it and not be so thrown by it. One of our couples, when they ended the therapy, they made an interesting comment. They said, we just feel steadier as a couple. We would have little incidents and they would throw us off kilter so much. And now we have some of those same incidents, but they don't throw us off. And I don't know precisely the things that changed, but I imagine it was both acceptance and change, so that they had some little incident, whatever their issue was, and a strong reaction to it. Now the person who reacted to it isn't reacting as strongly, the other person's not doing it as provocatively, and they're doing better. So that's the idea.
And do you go more globally, like just assessing the overall level of satisfaction? Is that an outcome measure too, even if you don't just count behaviors?
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, because ultimately, if the couple is happier and doing better and, whatever it is.
Isn't that the outcome?
That's the outcome they
essentially,
want,
right?
and if everything has changed or nothing has
You
changed.
can say I reduced fighting from 17 a week to
Right.
5, but they are miserable. So what kind of change is that?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Ford. Yeah.
How is the introduction, because social media has really become a big presence, especially in our generation, how has the introduction of social media changed some of the ways that you have to apply therapy with your clients? Do you find that you have to address social media problems more? Do you find that social media problems are kind of out of your realm of expertise and you can't deal with them?
We address them, certainly we address them more, but we only address them if it's a problem for them. So the kind of problems we'll address is, people not being attentive because they're always on their screen. Or, a big problem with couples is, one partner is on the screen, chatting with, other romantic partners or on Bumble or Tinder or whatever, and so that's an issue for them, or looking at porn or something like that. So that's, but the couple brings that to us, because that's part of the problem they're complaining about. And so that's the way we deal with it, is just as it's a presenting problem.
Throughout your experience, have you identified any key pattern that gets repeated in multiple couples that brings out the problem?
Key patterns in multiple couples that brings out the problem?
In couples in general, have you ever identified any pattern that gets repeated in different couples that you have?
Repetitive
therapy?
Patterns.
Yeah, there are a number of repetitive patterns. One I've studied a lot, over many years, and we've studied it cross-culturally, is what we call the withdraw-demand or demand-withdraw pattern. And it's where one partner is, upset about something and wanting to talk about it and maybe critical of the other person. The other person wants to avoid, shuts down, defensive, and it's a mutually exacerbating pattern. The more the one withdraws, shuts down, avoids, the more the other person gets frustrated and upset and critical, and the more the one gets critical and upset, the more the other shuts down. And so that's a very common pattern. And we've looked cross-culturally. We looked in gay and lesbian couples as well as straight couples, and that's a very common pattern in couples. And we've tried to look at some of the antecedents of that, but that's...
What about the core differences? In other words, has anybody done a kind of taxonomy of the core differences that couples bring in? Optimum distance closeness would be one dimension. One wants to spend more time together and one wants more independence or something. And there's an optimum level of time together. So that seems to be a very common, issue. And I was wondering, if you thought through all the couples that you saw, could you pull out 5, 10, 15 of these core dimensions of differences?
We've thought about that at times.
Really?
We haven't done it, systematically. We tried to do it a little bit by just looking. We had therapists at the end of our trial write what they
What
thought
the
was
core differences.
what the core issues were. We tried to pull it out there, but it got a little messy because
Really?
everybody describes it a little bit differently. But certainly I could mention some common ones.
Okay.
But, like you mentioned the closeness distance one.
Boundaries is another one.
Boundaries, right. There's another one that's really interesting to me is emotionality, where you have one person who's very emotional, very reactive, and the other person who's very non-reactive. And they can really escalate each other, and yet there's a real attraction sometimes.
Right.
The person who's very unemotional, got together with this very emotional person.
Yeah.
And the very emotional person got together with this very unemotional person. And there were other options in the world.
Yeah.
And so it's just really interesting what...
Two unemotional people or two people who are constantly...
constantly.
After
and
each
you
other.
see the benefit of an emotional and an unemotional person.
Yeah.
They kind
It can work very well.
It can work very well, and
yeah.
it can create some real problems.
Yeah.
Right.
Sometimes when I see couples, I classify them as complementary couples or symmetrical couples.
Right.
If you have two people who are not as emotionally reactive, they'd be symmetrical on that
Right.
dimension, or two people who are highly reactive,
Right.
very explosive, and then people who are complementary. And it seems like symmetrical and complementary couples have different vulnerabilities and different kinds of issues that they have.
I use that complementary symmetrical with regard to the pattern of interaction.
Yes,
You know?
yeah.
So like the classic Bickerson couple, you know,
Mhm.
they're constantly bickering and fighting and everything is a battle.
Right,
You know, they're symmetrical.
exactly.
The demand withdraw couple is asymmetrical or
Right.
complementary.
Exactly,
You know,
yeah.
or you have the mutually withdrawn couple where they never talk about anything and they never fight at all, but they have no connection with each other.
Exactly, yeah,
Right,
yeah, exactly.
right.
Any others? Any other question? You got one more, Erin?
Yeah. After all your experience working with so many couples, have you like wound up with any rules that you think apply to people broadly, like don't share finances or like don't go to bed angry, or are there too many different types of people that you can't apply a big rule, like follow this rule to avoid conflict in a relationship?
It would be hard for me to come up with that. Even to your phrase at the end, to avoid conflict. Like for many couples, that would be a goal, to avoid conflict. In fact, that's probably the more common goal. But there would be some couples who are so avoidant of each other or so hesitant that they haven't had a very honest, authentic relationship of really saying what they wanted or what they're unhappy with. And for them, it's not like you're trying to create conflict, but you're trying to help them be honest and open with each other. And if they're honest and open with each other, you know, they're always not going to line up because they're different people. And yet that might be a way of reinvigorating them a little bit. And so it kind of depends what the issue is. That's why it's very hard to come up with, you know, the kind of, I don't know if this magazine is still around, but the Ladies' Home Journal version of, you know, the 3 things you should do to make your marriage work.
Yeah. Well, we're just about at the end, and I just want to cycle back here because we started the conversation about the decision to become a psychologist, the beginning of it. And now that, you know, you've had this long career, what's been the best of it and what's been the worst of it?
Well, my first student was clearly the best.
That's right. Well, that goes without saying. Andy was my dissertation advisor, actually.
And he was my first student. That's
Yeah.
why, inside joke.
That's right. Yeah.
No, anyway, it's seriously, what was the best and what was the
Well, I
worst?
have to say one thing now that you've let that out. You know, when you were asking that question, Erin, about like, you know, are there, I don't know exactly how you phrased it, but certain rules almost, you know, things that he's distilled that he could tell, you know, couples don't go to bed angry or something that rises to a cliche almost. When the day that I got my PhD, you took me to the UCLA Faculty Center. Do you remember that?
No, not right now. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you did. Okay.
What did I say?
Yeah. Well, I'm saying that I remember asking you about, after all the years of teaching and studying psychology, do you have like any great pearls of wisdom that you've distilled from that, which is very similar to your question. You don't even remember taking me out to dinner, so I'm not going to suspect that you remember telling me that, but I remember. Okay, you told me 2 things, and I still remember them. One was good things are correlated with good things, and bad things are correlated with bad things. And then the second was, don't believe any finding that doesn't come out more than once.
There you go.
So correlation and reliability. This is what he tells me at the end of all that work.
After 5 years of work.
I knew that early years ago, but he said it so nicely. So anyway, the good and the bad?
Well, it's been, I mean, I feel very blessed because I've had a really good career and I've enjoyed it and done a lot of interesting things. And when I look back, I wish I would have enjoyed it more. I guess my you know, so often we're in the middle of doing something that could be wonderful and we don't appreciate it enough. You know, that happens with parents. You know, could
Yeah.
love to relive having my children young again.
Right,
And it
right.
just went by so quickly, and you're so busy doing everything that
Yeah.
you forget to enjoy it. And so I actually, I did enjoy my career greatly. I wish I would have, realized what a joy it was, because to be able to spend most of your life doing things that you're interested in, I mean, wow.
Yeah.
And to get paid for it, not paid very much, but to get paid for it
Yeah.
is really something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's been mainly good.
And the hardest thing, the thing about being a therapist, being a couples therapist, if you will,
The hardest thing about being a therapist, it's sometimes discouraging when I get attached to a couple and their problems seem so intractable. And my best efforts, and they just don't seem to get out of their hole. That's really hard.
Right.
And then it's hard sometimes when I think, oh boy, I wish I would have done that.
Yeah.
And I kind of think back, and maybe I didn't do that the best way. And,
Right,
I
right.
mean, because anytime you feel responsible, even in part, for somebody else's sadness or not being able to help them out of their pain and suffering, you feel bad.
Sure, sure.
So I think that would be the big thing.
Right, right. Well, you had a good impact on the whole audience here, and thank you for sharing
Okay.
the work
Enjoy
you've done.
it. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys for coming. Obviously, we're not